come along as we head down to the White House and visit with our 28th President, Woodrow Wilson. He served in office from 1913 to 1921 and led America through World War I. That was from 1914 to 1918. He was remembered as an advocate for democracy, progressivism, and world peace. Wilson left a complex legacy that included resurgentating many branches of the federal workforce. Wilson was a college professor, university president, and Democratic governor of New Jersey before winning the White House in 1912. Once in office, he pursued an ambitious agenda of progressive reform that included the establishment of the Federal Reserve and Federal Trade Commission. Wilson tried to keep the United States neutral during World War I, but ultimately called on Congress to declare war on Germany in 1917. After the war, he helped negotiate a peace treaty that included a plan of the League of Nations. Although the Senate rejected the U.S. membership to the League, Wilson received the Nobel Prize for his peacemaking efforts. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born on December 28, 1856, in Staunton, Virginia. Because his mother said he arrived around midnight, some sources list Wilson's birthday as December 29th. His father, Joseph Ringles Wilson, whose life spanned from 1822 to 1903, was a Presbyterian minister, and his mother, Janet Woodrow Wilson, whose life spanned from 1826 to 1888, was a minister's daughter and originally from England. Tommy Wilson, as he was called growing up, spent his childhood and teen years in Augusta, Georgia, and Columbia, South Carolina. During the American Civil War, on which we spoke about, Wilson's father served as a chaplain in the Confederate Army and used his church as a hospital for injured Confederate troops. Did you know Woodrow Wilson, who had a career as an academic and university president before entering politics, did not learn to read until he was 10, most likely due to dyslexia? Wilson graduated from Princeton University, then called the College of New Jersey, in 1879, and went on to attend law school at the University of Virginia. After briefly practicing law in Atlanta, Georgia, he received a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University in 1886. And Wilson remains the only U.S. president to earn a doctorate degree. He taught at Bryn Mawr College and Wesleyan College before being hired by Princeton in 1890 as a professor of jurisprudence and politics. From 1902 to 1910, Wilson was the president of Princeton, and he developed a natural reputation for his educational reform policies. Now, during his tenure, however, he also prevented enrollment of black students at the university. And in 1902, Wilson published a 5-volume textbook, The History of American People, which presented a romanticized view of the Confederacy and described the Ku Klux Klan as a violent terrorist group, as roving knight-errant, an invisible empire of the South, bound together in a loose organization to protect the Southern country of some of the ugliest hazards of its time of revolution. 1885 is when Wilson married Ellen Ansel, whose life spanned from 1860 to 1914, a minister's daughter and Georgia native. The couple had 3 daughters before Ellen died of kidney disease. In 1914, during her husband's first presidential term, the following year, Wilson married Edith Bowling Galt, whose life spanned from 1872 to 1961. A widow whose husband had owned a Washington, D.C. jewelry business. Um, 1910, Woodrow Wilson was elected governor of New Jersey, where he fought machine politics and garnered national attention as a progressive reformer. In 1912, the Democrats nominated Wilson for president, selecting Thomas Marshall, whose life spanned from 1854 to 1825, the governor of Indiana, as his vice presidential running mate. The Republican Party split over their choice for a presidential candidate. Conservative Republicans renominated William Taft, while the progressive wing broke off to form the Progressive or Bull Moose Party and nominated Theodore Roosevelt, who had served as president from 1901 to 1909. With the Republicans divided, Wilson, who campaigned on a platform of liberal reform, won 435 electoral votes, compared to 88 for Roosevelt and 8 for Taft. He earned nearly 42% of the popular vote. Roosevelt came in second place with more than 27% of the popular vote. At the age of 56, Woodrow Wilson was sworn into office in March of 1913. He was the last American president to travel to his inauguration ceremony in a horse-drawn carriage. Once in the White House, Wilson achieved significant progressive reform. Congress passed the Underwood-Simmons Act, which reduced the tax on imports and imposed new federal income tax. It also passed legislation establishing the Federal Reserve, which provides a system for regulating the nation's bank, credits, and money supply. The Federal Trade Commission, which investigates any and prohibits unfair business practice. Other accomplishments include child labor laws an 8-hour day for railroad workers, and government loans to farmers. Additionally, Wilson nominated the first Jewish person to the U.S. Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis, whose life spanned from 1856 to 1941, who was confirmed by the Senate in 1916. Wilson's progressive agenda didn't apply to all Americans, however. During his first term, he oversaw the resegregation of many branches of the federal workforce, including the Treasury, the Post Office, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the Navy, the Interior, the Marine Hospital, the War Department, and the Government Printing Office. The action revised hard-fought economic progress made by Black Americans since Reconstruction. During World War I, when World War I broke out in Europe in the summer of 1914, Wilson was determined to keep the United States out of the conflict. On May 7, 1915, a German submarine torpedoed and sank the British ocean liner Louisiana, killing more than 1,100 people, including 128 Americans. Wilson continued to maintain U.S. neutrality, but warned Germany that any future sinkings would be viewed by America as deliberately unfriendly. In 1916, Wilson and Vice President Marshall were renominated by the Democrats. The Republicans chose Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes as their presidential candidate and Charles Fairbanks as U.S. Vice President under Theodore Roosevelt as his running mate. Wilson, who campaigned on the slogan, "He keeps us out of war," won with a narrow election margin of 277 to 254 and a little more than 49% of the popular vote. At the age of 56, Woodrow Wilson was sworn into office in March of 1913. When Wilson returned from Europe in the summer of 1919, he encountered opposition to the Versailles Treaty from Islamic Republican to Congress, who feared the League could limit America's economy and draw the country into another war. In September of that year, the president embarked on a cross-country speaking tour to promote his idea for the League directly to American people. On the night of September 25th, on a train bound for Wichita, Kansas, Wilson collapsed from mental and physical stress, and the rest of his tour was canceled. On October 2nd, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. Wilson's condition was largely or kept largely hidden from the public, and his wife worked behind the scenes to fulfill a number of his administrative duties. The Senate voted the Treaty of Versailles first in November of 1919 and again in March of 1920. Both times it's failed to gain 2/3 votes required for ratification. The treaty's defeat was partially blamed on Wilson's refusal to compromise with the Republicans. The League of Nations held its first meeting in January of 1920. The United States never joined the organization. However, in December of 1920, Wilson received the 1919 Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to include the Convent of the League of Nations in the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson's second administration saw the passage of two significant amendments. The era of prohibition was ushered in on January 17, 1920, when the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, went into effect the following the ratification 1 year earlier. In 1919, Wilson vetoed the National Prohibition Act, or Violstead Act, designed to enforce the 18th Amendment. However, his veto was overridden by Congress. Prohibition lasted until 1933, when it was repealed by the 21st Amendment. Also in 1920, American women gained the right to vote when the 19th Amendment became law that August. Wilson had pushed Congress to pass the amendment. That year's presidential election, the first in which women from every state were allowed to vote, resulted in a victory for Republican Warren Harding, a congressman from Ohio who opposed the League of Nations and campaigned for a return to normalcy after Wilson's tenure in the White House. After leaving office in March of 1921, Woodrow Wilson resided in Washington, D.C. He and a partner established a law firm, but poor health prevented the president from ever doing any serious work. Wilson died at his home on February 3rd of 1924 at the age of 67. He was buried in the Washington National Cathedral, the only president to be interred in the nation's capital. And with that, we'll return to our homes, and I'll see you in the next one.